Welcome to Free History. I'm your host, Will Hickox. In response to growing interest in the histories of issues like civil rights, race, and democracy that are filling headlines today, several cultural institutions in Kansas have partnered to present a series of interviews with historians and other experts touching on connections between historical events and human rights today. Free History is a collaboration between the Hall Center for the Humanities, Humanities Kansas, the Watkins Museum of History, Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, and the University of Kansas Department of African and African American Studies. This program was also made possible by a National Endowment for the Humanities CARES Act grant. We encourage you to follow our Facebook page, Free History, a video series, to see our schedule of upcoming events. This year marks the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This is one of the three Reconstruction Amendments passed in the wake of the Civil War and designed to expand the rights of formerly enslaved African Americans in addition to other purposes. The 15th Amendment reads, Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2, the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. With this video interview debuting on November 2nd, 2020, just before the 2020 presidential election, commemorating the 15th Amendment and discussing voting rights are certainly pertinent historical topics. So I'm very excited to welcome our guest here today. Our guest is Dr. Kate Mazur. Kate teaches American history at Northwestern University and has contributed to several edited collections. Additionally, she wrote a book titled An Example for All the Land, Emancipation and the Struggle Over Equality in Washington, D.C. And she has a new book coming out in March 2021, Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction. So Kate, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Kate, your research focuses on, to quote the title of one of your edited books, The World the Civil War Made. The United States emerged victorious in 1865 as the Confederacy was defeated. Now the federal government faces this enormous task of reconstruction, bringing the rebellious states back into the Union. So I wonder if you can talk to us about what were the major difficulties and controversies that the nation faced at this moment.
The question really brings us to the moment when the 15th Amendment was passed and ratified. So it's really critical to understand, where the context for where the United States was in that moment. As you said, the end of the Civil War brought huge new challenges to the United States. And so, when we think about that period and we think beyond simply, who won and who lost the Civil War, we really need to think about the challenges at hand. And I usually think about those challenges in two main ways. First is the question of how do you bring the states that had declared themselves out of the Union back into the Union, on what terms? And so the question is sort of what terms are imposed on those states for having declared that they had left, for on the people who led the rebellion for basically committing treason against the United States and then kind of losing in their bid for independence as a separate nation. What kinds of terms are the states going to have to follow if they want to be back in the Union, and how do we know when they've completed those terms? And when I say we, I think I'm saying the people who were then in Congress kind of making federal policy. So this set of questions about the terms on which the former Confederate states are going to come back into the unions is one big set of really tough questions. And the other set of tough questions that is related and intertwined with that first set is what will be the status of African Americans, particularly newly freed African Americans in the United States. And so this raises all kinds of questions. The struggle, the Civil War itself was a war over slavery. It was a war over the future of slavery in the United States. At the time that the Civil War began, there were about 4 million African Americans enslaved in the United States. And that's a lot of people. And also there's a tremendous commitment by many white Southerners to preserve slavery. And so, the question, and so when the Confederacy is defeated, the question of what will happen, how will the end of slavery truly be implemented? What does that look like? Who will enforce it? Who will oppose the end of slavery, and kind of who will bring the force necessary to bear to ensure not only that slavery no longer exists, but that some version of freedom actually comes into being. And what that looks like are, sort of questions around, at least from the perspective of public policy, questions around civil rights and the right to vote. And I would say, just to add a third little, I guess we'll get to this, but a third topic not emanating from Washington, D.C. My first two comments were sort of reunification of the nation and policy regarding formerly enslaved people. But the third big question then is, how do the people who were just freed from slavery, how do they then go about making their lives? What does Southern society in particular look like in the wake of slavery?
Much of your work, Kate, explores Black activism over emancipation and civil rights during Reconstruction. What was the situation that Black Americans faced in 1865, and what rights and social roles did they seek now that they had supposedly been freed? And I'd encourage you, even if you would like, to take us back before Reconstruction and bring the research that you've done for your newest book into the discussion.
The institution of slavery was so intensely integrated into Southern life in the United States that the process of destroying it was actually very complicated. And I think, at some point along the way, I had the realization, and, now to me, this seems very basic, but, the realization that what does the abolition of slavery look like? It doesn't look like, Abraham Lincoln waves a proclamation and poof, slavery's abolished. Or it doesn't even look like Congress passes and the states ratify the 13th Amendment and then slavery goes bye-bye, right? Because a lot of white Southerners don't want to part with slavery. And so if we put ourselves on the ground in slave states in around 1865 as the Civil War ends, you're going to see, first of all, a hodgepodge of different kind of conditions. So, for example, in places where there had been a lot of fighting between the US forces and the Confederate forces, so in those places in the South, slavery was partially or wholly destroyed during the Civil War. And that is partly because when the fighting came to a particular area, enslaved people used that as an opportunity to stop working, to stop doing what enslavers wanted them to do, to run away, to find their way to union lines where they could be employed for wages, working for the United States Army, enlisting in the Navy. And so in some areas of the US South, slavery had kind of come apart thanks in no small measure to the actions and the agency of enslaved people themselves. But there were a lot of other places that the military kind of expeditions hadn't really touched, or hadn't touched so significantly, where slave owners still commanded tremendous power as the war ended, where, some places, and including in more remote places and kind of the interior of slave states, or places in Texas where people hadn't heard of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued on January 1st, 1863, they still, by the spring and summer of 1865, really even hadn't gotten the news of it yet. And so just to kind of paint the picture of a patchwork of different kind of conditions. And so what you see over the course of the next several years is a very, very volatile situation. I mean, there's nowhere that formerly enslaved people did not assert their rights to be free. And then one of the things that people wanted above all was the ability to bring families together and organize communities along lines that they wanted. So this is a world in which Black families had been separated, members of families had been sold away from one another during the course of slavery. And so what people really wanted, and you see this over and over again, was, apart from, and I'll talk about it in a second, like claims to rights and citizenship, but apart from all of that, the most foundational thing was, we want to live in our own communities. We want to own our own land in this primarily rural society. We want to have the family formations that we value. We want to find lost relatives who might have been sold away from us, and kind of develop our lives outside of the oversight and oppression of white people. And so that's a kind of primary goal that you see over and over again. And also over and over again, you see white people trying to kind of stymie those goals. But so, within that then, particularly in the world of politics, like party politics, in churches, in political organizations, African Americans are also claiming rights, right? So equal rights, the equal right to testify in court, to own property, to be a witness in a trial, and then to vote, right? And then equal access to public education, to public accommodations like railroads and streetcars and hotels and theaters. And so in every realm you think of, sometimes people are more familiar with the 20th century civil rights struggle. And I sometimes say, in every realm where you can imagine civil rights organizing happening in the 20th century, when you think of lunch counter sit-ins and bus boycotts and things like that, all of those same things were at issue during Reconstruction, because African Americans and their white allies could see that the possibility of creating a new society on terms of racial equality.
That's fascinating. So during this remarkable 5-year period that began in 1865, we got 3 amendments to the US Constitution. So the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery. The 14th is mainly remembered for sort of defining or enshrining birthright citizenship and equality before the law, among some other things. The 15th, of course, is the main topic at hand in today's discussion. So could you give us some insights into the making of the 15th Amendment? What were the principal groups that worked to get this legislation passed? And why did they believe that it was so necessary to change the Constitution on the subject of voting rights?
So one thing that's important to understand in kind of general sense is the original United States Constitution from the founding of the US gave states tremendous amount of power, including in areas associated with individual rights. And so part of the reason, for example, that you could have slavery in the first place was because the Constitution actually didn't really say anything about the ability of states to continue to have slavery. And so when the United States was founded, the places where slavery already existed in the colonies, it was up to them to decide as states whether to continue to have slavery or not. And we're familiar, at least, with some of that story where the northern tier of states abolishes slavery in the era of the American Revolution, whether immediately or gradually, whereas the southern tier of states continues to have slavery and slavery continues to expand. But it's not just in slavery, it's in actually, relevant to this discussion, in the area of voting rights as well. The original Constitution left just about everything associated with voting rights in the hands of the states. And so the states had kind of no limits on who they could enfranchise and who they could disenfranchise. And so, so states did a variety of different things. Now, the general trend at the beginning of the United States, some states allowed African-American men and other men of color to vote. Some states had property requirements. Only New Jersey ever allowed women, and formally allowed women to vote. And then over time, the trend in the North and to some extent in the South as well was to go increasingly towards states only allowing white men to vote or white male citizens to vote. And so, but the point is that there's 2 points. One is states can decide this, right? 100%. And point number 2 is a kind of predisposition to have the people who can vote are white men. Now that is hotly contested. A part of the thing I write about in my forthcoming book is the ongoing struggle in the free states for African-American men's right to vote. So pushing back against the disenfranchisement of Black men in places like Pennsylvania, or places where Black men were never allowed to vote in the Midwest, like in Ohio and Illinois. But in any event, when you get to the Civil War, there's no national baseline or standard for the right to vote. So one key thing to know about the Reconstruction Amendments, all 3 of them, is that each one of them has this congressional enforcement clause in it. In the 13th and 15th Amendment, it's Section 2. In the 14th Amendment, it's Section 5. It says Congress has the power to pass appropriate legislation to enforce this amendment. What that is saying is that in the case of the 15th Amendment is Congress now has some power over the right to vote in the states. So you no longer, so the 15th Amendment says no state can, or the federal government can abridge a citizen's right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Congress has the power to enforce that. So if you sort of think about it in the kind of most literal, narrow sense possible, it's saying states can go ahead and continue to put whatever restrictions and regulations on voting that they always did. The one thing they cannot do is discriminate based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So that is so important, and it's so different from anything that had come before in kind of asserting that there is a congressional or a federal power to say something, anything about the right to vote. And we can talk about the shortcomings of the way they put that amendment together. But to begin is just to say it was a tremendous departure from what had come before. And just to circle back, like all three of those amendments, by giving Congress power to enforce certain individual rights, whether it's the right to not be enslaved, the right to equal protection or due process of the law, the right to be considered a citizen, the right to vote if not being taken away based on race or color, all of those things where Congress now has some say over it, has some power over that. That is why sometimes people call the Reconstruction Amendments the second founding, because they're really redistributing power in the United States by making the US government a backstop of individual rights in instances where state and local governments are violating people's rights.
Some of the impetus for this legislation did come from the ground up, from conventions of African American men and things like that. But what was the principal group in Congress that worked on getting this amendment passed?
Right. Thanks. So thanks for bringing me back to that. So yeah, so first of all, you know, as you mentioned, what we see coming out, in some ways coming out of those struggles for the vote in the pre-Civil War North, African Americans are particularly, Northern African Americans are already very well organized to lobby for the right to vote. And then in the South, as the Civil War ends, you see all of these Black conventions meeting where people are organizing and saying, we're full citizens, we're entitled to the right to vote. And so, you know, that's kind of happening at the local level and at the state level. In Congress, first of all, it's the Republican Party that is advocating all of these measures. And it's important to recognize that the white Northerners were quite divided on what should happen next. And there's a whole political party, the Democrats at that time, who were pretty opposed, or much of the time, to these Reconstruction measures. So with some exceptions, the Democratic Party, which was not the party in power, white Northern Democrats generally wanted to see a much more relaxed, generous, toward the white South kind of policy about Reconstruction. And it's really the Republican Party, which, as people will remember, you know, Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president. Ulysses S. Grant was a Republican president, of course, a really accomplished general. So it's the Republicans that are driving the Reconstruction agenda in Congress and driving the passage of these amendments. And so when it comes to the 15th Amendment, it's really driven by Republicans in Congress who want to pass this third of three Reconstruction amendments. But interestingly, also, they're quite divided. And so just like thinking about any kind of political party today, where you have within a political party people with a variety of different kind of ideological views who come together around certain issues enough so that they can all be in the same political party, the same kind of thing was true back then. The Republicans were a diverse group of people with different kinds of interests and priorities. And so part of the debate about all the amendments, but in this case, talking about the 15th, was, you know, what kind of a 15th Amendment, a voting rights amendment, can get through Congress with enough votes. And so the debates about the 15th Amendment are very intense because you have a lot of Republicans who have different views on what to do. And I can talk about that a little bit. I mean, we ended up with the very simple, very kind of spare amendment that prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or previous condition. At the time, some of the more expansive visions of the 15th Amendment would have also included prohibitions on discrimination in the right to vote, okay, not only on race, color, and previous condition, but also by religion, by level of education, by gender, or what they called sex at the time. but particularly on the religion and level of education types of potential bans, those were designed to ensure that, number one, that it wasn't possible to discriminate against immigrants in the right to vote, naturalized, let's say immigrants, for example, Catholics, people who faced a lot of discrimination as well in the United States at that time. The literacy requirement, same thing. It would have also applied to immigrants, but also in a very kind of prescient way, some Republicans recognized that without building in a more expansive set of terms for the 15th Amendment, that people, even in the South, people would find ways of getting around it through things like literacy tests and poll taxes, because those were not explicitly included in the 15th Amendment. And one of the things that's very, tough to see, especially in retrospect, is that really some Republicans in Congress predicted that that's what Southern white people in particular would resort to disenfranchise people. And yet that more expansive language didn't get into the amendment because it couldn't have, there weren't enough people, who would have voted for it to get it through. And so what we got was kind of the lowest common denominator that could get through Congress at that time. I should add, another thing that, we can point out is the phrasing of this amendment is states can't discriminate on this basis of race, color, and previous condition. And so what it also doesn't do is affirmatively say all male citizens of the United States have the right to vote, right? So that kind of language was also under discussion at the time, that you could have had, instead of another curb on the states, you could have actually had, instead of saying the states can't do this, you could have said, this is the federal baseline is all citizens, male citizens have the right to vote. And we didn't have that either. And so that has also continued to keep the power over voting rights much more squarely in the hands of the states than it would have been.
With the help of legislation like the 15th Amendment and their Republican allies in Congress and in the presidency, Black Americans were able to make some remarkable accomplishments during Reconstruction. And so what achievements did Black Americans and their allies make during this period? And how were white Southerners gradually able to take back these freedoms that had been so hard won?
So one of the things that I think people find maybe hard to fathom about Reconstruction in its heyday is how much seemed to be possible and what actually was going on at the time. So among the accomplishments of African Americans at the time were, first of all, to go back to what I was saying before, people developing communities in freedom and kind of unleashing this sense of building of a community, like kind of ideas and propositions and plans that people could have, but for slavery, could have done all along, right? And so you see the flowering of African-American churches of a variety of denominations, independent churches, where enslaved people had sometimes been involved in white-led churches, but their opportunities for independent religious worship were very, very limited during the time of slavery. And so there's just a blossoming of African-American Methodist and Baptist churches in particular, but Presbyterian churches as well, and other kinds of denominations, as well as a huge movement for education. So people knew, having come through slavery, that one of the most important things you can have access to is literacy and numeracy, because in part because they had been denied it, or at least because white Southerners had tried to deny it. And so you see all across the South, people who, maybe there were a few people, Black people who had been free before the war, or people who had learned literacy during slavery, even, in secret, immediately moving to found schools, whether they would meet in somebody's house or meet in a church, People pooled their resources to buy land where you could have a church and a school together, often in the same building. There was a federal Freedmen's Bureau, which only existed for a short amount of time, but the Freedmen's Bureau helped with providing school buildings, so the kind of resources to actually build a school. And then some northern philanthropic organizations also helped furnish teachers. But there were also a lot of Southern white and Black teachers in those free people's schools. And so all of these kind of efforts to develop the structures of community from the most kind of intimate families being reunited to the level of schools and churches and cultural institutions, and then to the level of politics. And so, you know, I think the number always escapes me, but somewhere around 2,000 African-American men were elected to some kind of office during Reconstruction. So best known are the people who were elected to the US Congress. And so from a number of districts throughout the South, men were sent to Congress. There were a couple of African-American senators, US senators in this period. But in addition to that, and in many ways more important to people's daily lives, were the African-American sheriffs, the African-American tax collectors, the city council members, the state legislators, people who really had a lot to do with shaping policy that affected people's lives. And you see in Southern states the origins of public education in this period. And so, you know, Southern states, the people who had run those states before the Civil War, if they cared about education, they sent their own children to private schools or got them tutors, but never put very much of an effort into funding public education, even for white students. What you see during Reconstruction under the Republican state governments during Reconstruction is an effort to build organized public school systems that are going to serve Black and white children in those states. And so there's just really this kind of outpouring of innovation and real kind of examples of what biracial democracy in the US South looks like, when everyone, in this case all men, Black and white, have the equal opportunity to vote. And therefore, sometimes Black men are also going to be elected to office. The priorities of African-American men, but not only African-Americans, but also of poorer white Southerners who often did not have a voice in politics, or their views were not very well represented in politics before the Civil War. Now there are possibilities for their voices to be heard as well. Sometimes the poorer white Southerners become part of the Republican coalition in the South. And so it's a tremendously dramatic change in the way that Southern politics works, a much more competitive political environment in the South than had been seen in the antebellum decades, where planters were really in charge of Southern politics at the state level. Yeah, so you asked about, you know, how then do white Southerners begin to kind of take that back? And that story really varies kind of state by state. It kind of depends on the strength of African-American political power in different places, the extent to which white Southerners or white Northerners who have come into the South are part of the Republican coalition. But by the end of the 1870s, the Democrats have taken back control over all the Southern states. So basically between about 1868 and 1877, the Democrats take back power. And where they first do it is where they can do it most easily. And that is or with the least friction. And that's places where the Republicans are less strong, where the Black population is smaller. And so the holdout states where there's a large African-American population who are voting, who are not backing down in the face of intimidation, are also the places that become the most violent in the 1870s. Places like South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, where there's no way that white Southerners can take back political power without essentially perpetrating kind of terrorism on Black communities. And so, you know, the general thing is through all kinds of mechanisms, whether it's straight up regular politics or fraud, you know, kind of voter fraud, things like suppressing the vote, removing ballot boxes from places, not having polling places in Black communities, not counting the votes of Republicans, you know, these kind of fraudulent measures that are not necessarily violent, but still not playing fair, all the way up through, murder, intimidation, rape of African American people, and occasionally also of their white Republican allies, is how, in the long kind of scheme of things, white Southerners take back power in this context. The 1880s, to get really specific, are very interesting because when we sort of say, oh, Reconstruction ended with the Compromise of 1877 and kind of like, and then fast forward to 1965, that doesn't quite capture it because it's not everywhere that African-American men were disenfranchised. And in some places in the 1880s, there continue to be really interesting politics. Black men continue to vote. There are interesting coalitions like the Readjuster Coalition in Virginia. And so it's really not until the 1890s that there's a kind of more systematic, at the kind of state constitution level, crackdown on Black voting. And yes, what transpires then is the kind of vast disenfranchisement of African American voters that really doesn't get remediated by the way, bringing back federal power until the 1960s and the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
I've been driving this discussion in the context of Reconstruction, but isn't it true that certainly this amendment and the whole concept of voting rights for Black people was certainly significant for all Black Americans, not just in the South? It must have been a significant milestone for Northerners as well as Southerners.
Yeah, that is definitely true. And yeah, so there's resistance in the North, both among some Republicans, but a lot of Northern Democrats, to enfranchising Black men in the North. It was a very familiar struggle to anyone who had lived in the North over the previous few decades. They fully knew that African Americans wanted Black men to have the right to vote and had been campaigning for it. And a lot of white Republicans actually supported it. And one of the things was kind of worries about if they pushed it really hard, would they lose support? So there's a kind of issue, which is universally the case, of politicians always trying to balance what they want with what they think is politically feasible at any given moment. But it's true that when the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, Black men across the South were already voting in the states that had seceded because Congress had passed this law in 1867, the Reconstruction Act, which demanded and required that African American men in the former Confederacy be allowed to vote. So the most immediate impact of the 15th Amendment was to require Northern states now to permit African American men to vote. And there was a certain amount of resistance to that and a certain amount of violence associated with some elections in the 1870s in the North. There's a famous incident of a kind of election day riot by white people in Philadelphia that ended in the killing of Octavius Catto, who was a really well-known Black activist from Philadelphia. And just recently, a monument to him was put up in the city of Philadelphia. But generally speaking, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that in the Northern states, there's no systematic race-based disfranchisement in the coming decades. It's also true that in many places, the stakes were lower than in the Southern states because the proportion of African Americans was much smaller in the Northern states. But Black voters in the North also, especially in city elections, began to be able to exert a fair amount of influence, because if you had a kind of critical mass of African American population in a particular area, let's say in a city or a county, they could actually, even if they were still in a minority or a pretty dramatic minority of the population, they still could put their weight behind one candidate or another and change the outcomes of elections. So Black voting power in the North is actually interesting and not insignificant in the period from, let's say, the 1870s until the Great Migration, until there's like a much larger African American population in the North.
Okay, so I have one final question to round out this excellent discussion that we've been having. It's no secret that racism, inequality, and voter suppression are hot button issues currently that are causing a lot of anxiety and concern for the future. So in your opinion, what is the significance of the 15th Amendment 150 years after it passed? And does it inform voting rights today, and how should it inform voting rights today?
The 15th Amendment is the foundation of the principle that you can't discriminate in the right to vote based on race in this country. And so, to be sure, the 15th Amendment went drastically and tragically unenforced for many, many decades, especially, from the 1870s to the mid-1960s. So it has not always served us as it should have, because to make it work, you have to have people who are willing to enforce it. And people in power were not willing to enforce it in that period of Jim Crow, in that period before the Civil Rights Movement. And so it's not a magic bullet. It's not going to save us. But the 15th Amendment is the foundation of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is an expansive federal law, since amended many times, that builds in what it really looks like to ban discrimination based on race. So it's not, a very tight little sentence. It's like many, many, many sentences about how to go about making sure that this isn't happening. That statute, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, would not be constitutional if it were not for the 15th Amendment, right? So we have to have the 15th Amendment before we can have the Voting Rights Act. And then we have had, until, somewhat recently, decades of more or less, interpretation of the Voting Rights Act and its subsequent statutes and the 15th Amendment as recognizing that certain kinds of strategies and tactics that make it harder for people to vote, but do not use the language of race, like in the old days, poll taxes or literacy tests, and in the newer days, strict voter ID laws that apply way more to some groups than others, or reduction in the number of polling places. These kind of measures that do not say, yes, this is because we don't want certain groups of people to vote. We don't want Black people to vote, or we don't want Latino people to vote, or we don't want students, college students to vote. They don't explicitly say that, but the way they work is going to tend to depress the vote among those groups of people. And again, actually, let me just point out that in the case of race, it doesn't necessarily even have to be out of explicitly racist motivations, but rather motivations of you want your side to win, so you want likely voters on the other side not to vote, okay? But the interpretations of the Voting Rights Act over time allowed for judges and legislators and activists and voter, people who oversee voting to understand that you can't, if the impact is that it essentially disfranchises groups on the basis of race or kind of groupings that look racial, that also falls under the 15th Amendment. So we were able to get beyond the kind of shenanigans that the people in the 1890s pulled of saying, oh, no, literacy test, that has nothing to do with race, right? And so the real concern is that too many of those kind of tactics, again, which have been around for a very long time, are being permitted now. And that, the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County in 2013 really made it much easier for state governments to pass new kinds of rules around voting that would not have gone through if this pre-clearance were still in effect, which is what the Shelby County decision took away. And so, when you look back at a history, we still have, the point is we still have the 15th Amendment, but when you look back to the past, you just see that what we're seeing now in terms of efforts to depress the vote, depress turnout, make it harder for people to vote, these don't actually look that different from the kinds of things that white Southerners, for example, did in the 1890s, who at the time were also saying, this isn't about race. This is actually just about wanting to make sure that illiterate people aren't voting or what have you. So I think we have to be really, careful, and we have to be really suspicious or kind of questioning about taking at face value what people are saying. And similarly with accusations of voter fraud, I mean, those go way back to Reconstruction as well, of, when people who one group doesn't really like to see voting and worries about having political power, when those folks are voting, the other side will say, oh, but they're fraudulently bringing in voters who shouldn't be voting and things like that. That goes way back, and we're seeing that now. So I think there's a lot to be learned from the complicated and sometimes very violent and very unfortunate history of voting rights in this country if we really want to kind of come to grips with what's going on now.
Well, this has been a very illuminating discussion, and I want to thank everyone for watching, and all the partners in the Free History Project and myself encourage you to exercise your own voting rights in every election. And I'd also like to thank Kate for joining us and giving her time and expertise in this excellent discussion. So thank you, Kate.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.